You are listening to the Worldwide Freedom Radio Network. The following is a special presentation of the Hour of the Time. It is part 3 of a 6-part series on mind control. This segment originally aired on June the 15th, 1994, and is tape number 376 in our catalog. Yes, folks, once again, you're listening to the Hour of the Time. As always, I'm still William Cooper. The technical services staff of the Central Intelligence Agency, ladies and gentlemen, realized that gaining information about the drug, LSD, in real-life situations was crucial to exploiting the drug to its fullest. The TSS started conducting experiments on its own people without their knowledge. On its own people, ladies and gentlemen, that's the kind of people they are. Scumbags. There was an extensive amount of self-experimentation. The Office of Security felt the TSS group was playing with fire, especially when it was learned that TSS was prepared to spike an annual office Christmas party punch with LSD. The Christmas party of the Central Intelligence Agency. Can you imagine Richard Helms swinging from the chandelier, or stooping in a corner, looking for dragons? LSD, ladies and gentlemen, could produce serious insanity for periods of 8 to 18 hours and possibly longer. One of the victims of the punch was Agent Frank Olson. You see, they did it. Having never had drugs before, LSD took its toll on Olson. He reported that every automobile that came by was a terrible monster with fantastic eyes out to get him personally. And each time a car passed, he would huddle down against a parapet, terribly frightened. Olson began to behave erratically. The Central Intelligence Agency made preparation to treat Olson at Chestnut Lodge, but before they could, he checked into a New York hotel and threw himself out from his 10th-story room. The Central Intelligence Agency was ordered to cease all drug testing. And of course, they did not. Mind control drugs and experiments were torturous to the victims. One of these 3 inmates who died in Vacaville prison in July was scheduled to appear in court in an attempt to stop forced administration of a drug, the very drug that may have played a role in his death. Joseph Canada believed he was making progress and did not need forced dosages of the drug Haldol. The Solano County Coroner's Office said that Canada and 2 other inmates died of hyperthermia. That's extremely elevated body temperature. Remember, I said hyperthermia. Elevated body temperature. Their bodies all had at least 108 degrees temperature when they died, and I'm talking core temperature, folks. The psychotropic drugs they were being forced to take will elevate body temperature. Dr. Ewan Cameron, working at McGill University in Montreal, used a variety of experimental techniques, including keeping subjects unconscious for months at a time, administering huge electroshocks and continual doses of LSD. Massive lawsuits developed as a result of this testing. and many of the subjects who suffered trauma had never agreed to participate in the experiments. Such Central Intelligence Agency experiments infringed upon the much-honored Nuremberg Code concerning medical ethics. Dr. Cameron was one of the members of the Nuremberg Tribunal. LSD research was also conducted at the Addiction Research Center of the United States Public Health Service in Lexington, Kentucky. This institution was one of several used by the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Institute of Mental Health, and the United States Navy funded this operation. Vast supplies of LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs were required to keep the experiments going. Dr. Harris Isbell ran the program. He was a member of the Food and Drug Administration's Advisory Committee on the Abuse of Depressant and Stimulant Drugs. And they want to take your vitamins away. Almost all of the inmates were black, ladies and gentlemen. No racism in this country, you better guess again. Almost all of the inmates were black. In many cases, LSD dosage was increased daily for 75 days. Some 1,500 United States soldiers of all races were also victims of drug experimentation. Some claimed they had agreed to become guinea pigs only because of pressure from their commanding officers. Many claimed they suffered from severe depression and other psychological stress. One such soldier was Master Sergeant Jim Stanley. LSD was put in Stanley's drinking water, and he freaked out. Stanley's hallucinations continued even after he returned to his regular duties. His service record suffered. His marriage went on the rocks, and he ended up beating his wife and children. It wasn't until 17 years later that Stanley was informed by the military that he had been an LSD experimental subject. Of course, his wife was ruined. He sued the government, but the Supreme Court ruled that no soldier could sue the Army for the LSD experiments. Justice William Brennan disagreed with the court decision. He wrote this, and I quote, "Experimentation with unknowing human subjects is morally and legally unacceptable." And I agree with him 100%, ladies and gentlemen. Private James Thornwall was given LSD in a military test in 1961. For the next 23 years, he lived in a mental fog, eventually drowning in a Vallejo swimming pool in 1984. Congress had set up a $625,000 trust fund for him. Large-scale LSD tests on American soldiers were conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, Fort Benning, Georgia, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, Dugway Proving Ground, Utah, and in Europe and the Pacific. The Army conducted a series of LSD tests at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. The purpose of the tests were to ascertain how well soldiers could perform their tasks on the battlefield while under the influence of LSD. At Fort McClellan, Alabama, 200 officers in the Chemical Corps were given LSD in order to familiarize them with the drug's effects. At Edgewood Arsenal, soldiers were given LSD and then confined to sensory deprivation chambers and later exposed to a harsh interrogation session by intelligence people. In these sessions, it was discovered that soldiers would cooperate if promised they would be allowed to get off the LSD. In Operation Derby Hat, foreign nationals accused of drug trafficking were given LSD by the Special Purpose Team, with one subject begging to be killed in order to end his ordeal. Such experiments were also conducted in Saigon on Viet Cong POWs under the Phoenix Project, which Lieutenant Colonel James Bobo Gritz was a part of. We're going to get bumper stickers printed up, folks. It's going to say, "Grits for breakfast" in '96. If you want one, let us know. Now, this is going to be of special interest to everyone. One of the most potent drugs in the United States arsenal is called BZ, or quinupridinil benzylate. It is a long-lasting drug and brings on a litany of psychotic experiments and almost completely isolates any person from his environment. I'm going to say that again for you. It's a long-lasting drug. It brings on a litany of psychotic experiences and almost completely isolates any person from his environment. The main effects of BZ last up to 80 hours. That's 80 hours. 80 hours compared to 8 hours for LSD. Negative after effects may persist for up to 6 weeks. The BZ experiments were conducted on soldiers at Edgewood Arsenal for 16 years. Many of the victims claim that the drug permanently affected their lives in a negative way. It so disoriented one paratrooper that he was found taking a shower in his uniform and smoking a cigar. BZ was eventually put in hand grenades and a 750-pound cluster bomb. Other configurations were made for mortars, artillery, and missiles. The bomb was tested in Vietnam. The CIA documents indicate it was prepared for use by the United States in the event of large-scale civilian uprisings, and I published it in my book years ago, that when they suspend the Constitution and overtly create the one world government so that everybody knows it and has no doubt whatsoever, where Americans resist, they will be sprayed from the air with BZ. I wrote this years ago, folks. This is just confirmation. And you can find it in many, many other references to the mind control experiments of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Office of Naval Intelligence, Army G2, and others. It is important that we know these things so that we can prepare and so that we will not be taken off guard. They want it all. In Vacaville, psychosurgery has long been a policy. In one set of cases, experimental psychosurgery was conducted on 3 inmates, a black, a Chicano, and a Caucasian. This involved the procedure of pushing electrodes deep into the brain in order to determine the position of defective brain cells and then shooting enough voltage into the suspected area to kill the defective cells. One prisoner who appeared to be improving after surgery was released on parole but ended up back in prison. The second inmate became violent, and there is no information on the third inmate. Wonder where he is or what he's done. Vacaville also administered a terror drug, anectine, as a way of suppressing hazardous behavior. I've heard of hazardous materials. I've never heard of hazardous behavior. In small doses, anectine serves as a muscle relaxant. In huge doses, it produces prolonged seizure of the respiratory system and a sensation, quote, worse than dying, end quote. The drug goes to work within 30 to 40 seconds by paralyzing the small muscles of the fingers, toes, and eyes, and then moves into the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. The heart rate subsides to 60 beats per minute. Respiratory arrest sets in, and the patient remains completely conscious through the ordeal, which lasts 2 to 5 minutes. The experiments were also used at Atascadero. Several mind-altering drugs were originally developed for non-psychoactive purposes, and some of these drugs are phenothiazine and thorazine. The side effects of these drugs can be a living hell. The impact includes the feeling of drowsiness, disorientation, shakiness, dry mouth, blurred vision, and an inability to concentrate. Drugs like Prolixin are prescribed and described by users as sheer torture and becoming a zombie. The Veterans Administration, the VA hospital, has been shown by the General Accounting Office to apply heavy dosages of psychotherapeutic drugs. One patient was taking 8 different drugs: 3 antipsychotic, 2 anti-anxiety, 1 antidepressant, 1 sedative, and 1 anti-Parkinson. 3 of these drugs were being given in dosages equal to the maximum recommended. Another patient was taking 7 different drugs. One report tells of a patient who refused to take the drug. Quote, I told them I don't want the drug to start with. They grabbed me and strapped me down and gave me a forced intramuscular shot of Prolixin. They gave me Artane to counteract the Prolixin, and they gave me a Sinequan, which is a kind of tranquilizer to make me calm down, which overcalmed me. So rather than letting up on the medication, they then gave me Ritalin to pep me up, end quote. Ritalin, we'll get to that later. They're giving that to your children in school. Prolixin, ladies and gentlemen, lasts for 2 weeks. One patient describes how the drug does not calm or sedate nerves, but instead attacks from so deep inside you, you cannot locate the source of the pain. Quote, the drugs turn your nerves in upon yourself against your will, your resistance, your resolve, are directed at your own tissues, your own muscles, reflexes, etc., end quote. The patient continues. Quote, the pain grinds into your fiber. Your vision is so blurred you cannot read. You ache with restlessness so that you feel you have to walk, to pace. And then as soon as you start pacing, the opposite occurs to you. You must sit and rest, back and forth, up and down. You go in pain you cannot locate. In such wretched anxiety you are overwhelmed because you cannot get relief, even in breathing, end quote. And this is another quote. We need a program of psychosurgery for political control of our society. The purpose is physical control of the mind. Everyone who deviates from the given norm can be surgically mutilated. The individual may think that the most important reality is his own existence, but this is only his personal point of view. This lacks historical perspective. Man does not have the right to develop his own mind. This kind of liberal orientation has great appeal. We must electrically control the brain. Someday armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation of the brain. End quote. These, ladies and gentlemen, were the remarks of Dr. Jose Delgado as they appeared in the February 24th, 1974 edition of the Congressional Record, number 26, volume 118. Thought I was full of baloney, didn't you? Look it up. Despite Dr. Delgado's outlandish statements before Congress, folks, his work was financed by grants from the Office of Naval Research, the Air Force Aero Medical Research Laboratory, and the Public Health Foundation of the city of Boston. Dr. Delgado was a pioneer of the technology of electrical stimulation of the brain, or ESB. The New York Times ran an article on May 17, 1965, entitled Matador with a Radio Stops Wild Bull. The story details Dr. Delgado's experiments at Yale University School of Medicine and work in the field at Cordova, Spain. The New York Times stated this, quote, afternoon sunlight poured over the high wooden barriers into the ring as the brave bull bore down on the unarmed matador, a scientist who had never faced a fighting bull, but the charging animal's horn never reached the man behind the heavy red cape. Moments before that could happen, Dr. Delgado pressed a button on a small radio transmitter in his hand, and the bull braked to a halt. Then he pressed another button on the transmitter, and the bull obediently turned to the right and trotted away. The bull, you see, was obeying commands in his brain that were being called forth by electrical stimulation, by the radio signals to certain regions in which fine wires had been painlessly planted the day before, end quote. According to Dr. Delgado, experiments of this type have also been performed on humans. We know that these experiments were conducted in Canada at certain hospitals, and that certain unknowing, unwilling, unconsenting human subjects were implanted with small electrodes in the brain, and to this day are still being controlled by their handlers. Some have discovered these electrodes and are attempting to disclose the truth of these experiments. Of course, they are the targets of the government, the intelligence community, and some of them have borne tremendous injustices. While Dr. Delgado was giving a lecture on the brain in 1965, he said this, quote, "Science has developed a new methodology for the study and control of cerebral function in animals and humans," end quote. The late L.L. Vasiliev, professor of physiology, that's physiology at the University of Leningrad, wrote a paper about hypnotism, quote, "As a control of the subject's condition when she was outside the laboratory. In another set of experiments, a radio set was used. The results obtained indicate that the method of using radio signals substantially enhances the experimental possibilities," end quote. The professor continued to write, quote, "I.F. Tomaszewski, a Russian physiologist, carried out the first experiments with this subject at a distance of 1 or 2 rooms and under conditions that the participant would not know or suspect that she would be experimented with. In other cases, the sender was not in the same house and someone else observed the subject's behavior. Subsequent experiments at considerable distances were successful. One such experiment was carried out in a park at a distance. Mental suggestions to go to sleep were complied with within 1 minute," end quote. The Russian experiments in the control of a person's mind through hypnosis and radio waves were conducted in the 1930s, some 30 years before Dr. Delgado's bull experiment. Dr. Vasiliev definitely demonstrated that radio transmission can produce stimulation of the brain. It is not, ladies and gentlemen, a complex process as you may believe. In fact, it need not even be implanted within the skull or be productive of stimulation of the brain. All that is needed to accomplish the radio control of the brain is a twitching muscle. The subject becomes hypnotized and a muscle stimulant is implanted. The subject, while under hypnosis, is commanded to respond when the muscle stimulant is activated, in this case by radio transmission. Lincoln Lawrence wrote a book entitled "Were We Controlled?" Lawrence wrote, quote, "If the subject is placed under hypnosis and mentally programmed to maintain a determination eventually to perform one specific act, perhaps to shoot someone, it is suggested thereafter each time a particular muscle twitches in a certain manner, which is then demonstrated by using the transmitter, he will increase this determination even more strongly. As the hypnotic spell is renewed again and again, he makes it his life's purpose to carry out this act until it is finally achieved. Mr. Purdy, where are you?" Thus are the two complementary aspects of radiohypnotic intracerebral control, or RHIC, joined to reinforce each other and perpetuate the control until such time as the controlled behavior is called for. This is done by a second session with the hypnotist giving final instructions, and these might be reinforced with radio stimulation in more frequent cycles. They can even carry over the moments after the act to reassure calm behavior during the escape period, or to assure that one conspirator would not indicate that he was aware of the co-conspirator's role, or that he was even acquainted with him, or that he would put a gun to his own head and blow his own brains out before he could be questioned by anyone, end quote. RHIC constitutes the joining of two well-known tools, the radio part and the hypnotism part. People I found it difficult to accept that an individual can be hypnotized to perform an act which is against his moral principles. Some experiments have been conducted by the United States Army, which show that this popular perception is absolutely false. The chairman of the Department of Psychology at Colgate University, Dr. Estabrooks, has stated, quote, "I can hypnotize a man without his knowledge or consent into committing treason against the United States," end quote. I'm going to say that again, quote, "I can hypnotize a man without his knowledge or consent into committing treason against the United States," end quote. Estabrooks was one of the nation's most authoritative sources in the hypnotic field. The psychologist told officials in Washington that a mere 200 well-trained hypnotists could develop an army of mind-controlled sixth columnists in wartime United States. He laid out a scenario of an enemy doctor placing thousands of patients under hypnotic mind control and eventually programming key military officers to follow his assignment. Through such maneuvers, he said, the entire United States Army could be taken over. Large numbers of saboteurs could also be created using hypnotism through the work of a doctor practicing in a neighborhood on foreign-born nationals with close cultural ties with an enemy power. Dr. Estabrooks actually conducted experiments on United States soldiers to prove his point. Soldiers of low rank and little formal education were placed under hypnotism and their memories tested. Surprisingly, hypnotists were able to control the subject's ability to retain complicated verbal information. J.G. Watkins followed in Estabrooks' steps and induced soldiers of lower rank to commit acts which conflicted not only with their moral code, but with the military code which they had come to accept through their basic training. One of the experiments involved placing a normal, stable Army private in a deep trance. Watkins was trying to see if he could get the private to attack a superior officer, a cardinal sin in the military. While the private was in a deep trance, Watkins told him that the officer sitting across from him was an enemy soldier who was going to attempt to kill him. In the private's mind, it was a kill or be killed situation. The private did not see his own officer sitting there. He saw an enemy soldier. The private immediately jumped up and grabbed the officer by the throat. The experiment was repeated several times, and in one case the man who was hypnotized and the man who was attacked were very close friends. And the results were always the same. In one experiment, the hypnotized subject pulled out a knife and nearly accomplished the task. Subsequent experiments began with searching the subject to make sure that there were no more weapons. Watkins concluded that people could be induced to commit acts contrary to their morality if their reality was distorted by the hypnotism. Similar experiments were conducted by Watkins using WACs, or members of the Women's Army Corps, exploring the possibility of making military personnel divulge military secrets. I wonder what that experiment consisted of. Or I should say, you wonder, because I'm not going to tell you. A related experiment had to be discontinued because a researcher who had been one of the subjects was exposing numerous top-secret projects to his hypnotist, who did not have the proper security clearance for such information. The information was divulged before an audience of 200 military personnel. And one of the people propagating the extraterrestrial invasion myth, a Mr. Robert Lazar, was the partner in the ownership of a brothel, a house of prostitution, where license plates of the customers' cars were videotaped and the customers were videotaped. Could he have been participating in one of these mind control experiments, or maybe conducting it and then later, part of another vast mind control experiment on the American people to create the illusion of extraterrestrial abductions and the imminent threat of invasion of an extraterrestrial force? It could be, ladies and gentlemen, because when I was in the Office of Naval Intelligence, certain information was given to me that made me believe that that was what was happening until I stopped being stupid and began to do my own research. In man's quest to control the behavior of humans, there was a great breakthrough established by one Pavlov. You all have heard of him, who devised a way to make dogs salivate on cue. Now just think of the possibilities. He perfected his conditioning response technique by cutting holes in the cheeks of dogs and measured the amount they salivated in response to different stimuli. Pavlov verified that quality, rate, and frequency of the salivation changed, ladies and gentlemen, depending upon the quality, rate, and frequency of the stimuli. Though Pavlov's work falls far short of human mind control, it did lay the groundwork for future studies in mind and behavior control of humans. For that's what this is all ultimately directed at. John B. Watson conducted experiments in the United States on an 11-month-old infant. After allowing the infant to establish a rapport with a white rat, Watson began to beat on the floor with an iron bar every time the infant came in contact with the rat. After a time, the infant made the association between the appearance of the rat and the frightening sound and began to cry every time the rat came into view. Eventually, the infant developed a fear of any type of small animal. Watson was the founder of the behaviorist school of psychology, which calls itself a science, which really is no science whatsoever, based upon no facts whatsoever, based upon no scientific method whatsoever. Give me the baby, he says, and I'll make it climb and use its hands in constructing buildings or stone or wood. I'll make it a thief, a gunman, or a dope fiend. The possibilities of shaping in any direction are almost endless. Even gross differences in anatomical structure limits are far less than you may think. Make him a deaf mute, and I will build you a Helen Keller. Men are built, not born, end quote. And these are the people who want to have control of your children every day. Watson proclaimed his psychology did not recognize inner feelings and thoughts as legitimate objects of scientific study. He was only interested in overt behavior. I would like to experiment with Mr. Watson on some overt behavior. I have some very interesting proposals in mind. I would like to see how Mr. Watson behaves under my experimentation. Though Watson's work was the beginning of man's attempts to control human actions, the real work was done by B.F. Skinner, the high priest of the behaviorist movement. The key to Skinner's work was the concept of operant conditioning, which relied on the notion of reinforcement, which is, all behavior which is learned is rooted in either a positive or negative response to that action. There are two corollaries of operant conditioning, aversion therapy, and desensitization. You all are being subjected to desensitization every single day on purpose, intentionally. And most of you haven't got the brains to even realize it. Aversion therapy uses unpleasant reinforcement to a response which is undesirable. This, ladies and gentlemen, can take the form of electric shock, exposing the subject to fear-producing situations and the infliction of pain in general. It has been used as a way of curing homosexuality, alcoholism, and stuttering. Desensitization involves forcing the subject to view disturbing images over and over and over and over and over and over again until they no longer produce any anxiety, then moving on to more extreme images and repeating the processes over and over and over and over again until no anxiety is produced.
And that is what television is doing to all of the nation at the present time.
Eventually, the subject becomes immune to even the most extreme images. This technique is typically used to treat people's phobias. Thus, the violence shown on television could be said to have the unsystematic and intended effect of desensitization. Sleep well. Good night, and God bless you all.
The following is a special presentation of the Hour of the Time. It is episode number 4 in a 6-part series on mind control. This episode originally aired on June the 16th, 1994, and is number 377 in our catalog.
Yes, it is, once again, the Hour of the Time. I'm your host, William Cooper. Well, I know that some of you are out there shaking your head saying, how does he know that it's bullshit? Easy, folks. Our military has belonged to the United Nations for years. Check the treaties. Check State Department Publication 7277, all of it in the treason papers which we offer to you, and most of you been screaming for proof. Won't order them. Now you'd rather deal in this bullshit. Our military forces, ladies and gentlemen, is the police force for the United Nations and the New World Order. Now, if you haven't been reading the newspapers and you don't know that yet, then you're not playing with a full deck of cards, and you better get away from this poker table, because I'm going to take all your money. You're too stupid to play this game. Now wake up. If you don't believe what I've said, order the treason documentation. Study it for yourself, and then wake up. Now, last night we left off talking about B.F. Skinner, the high priest of the behaviorist movement. The key to Skinner's work was the concept of operant condition, which relied on the notion of reinforcement. All behavior which is learned is rooted in either a positive or negative response to that action. There are 2 corollaries of operant conditioning: aversion therapy, folks, and desensitization. Aversion therapy and desensitization. Aversion therapy uses unpleasant reinforcement to a response which is undesirable. It can take the form of electric shock, exposing the subject to fear-producing situations and the infliction of pain in general. It has been used as a way of curing homosexuality, alcoholism, and stuttering. Desensitization involves forcing the subject to view disturbing images over and over again until they no longer produce any anxiety, then moving on to more extreme images and repeating the process over again until no anxiety is produced. Eventually, the subject becomes immune to even the most extreme images. There's something beginning to click in your head. The intelligence community knows how to play games with your brain much better than you ever will, and you don't even know how to recognize it. How do you get people to stop paying attention? You keep giving them false information. You keep handing out phony documents. You keep circulating rumor after rumor after rumor, and pretty soon you're desensitized and you don't even pay any attention to it, and then one day you hear the truth and you ignore it. You silly, silly, silly fools. I've stated many times, and I've said it on this program, adult society is nothing more than bigger high school students practicing the same things that they learned in high school society. Skinnerian behaviorism has been accused of attempting to deprive man of his free will, his dignity, and his autonomy. It is said to be intolerant of uncertainty in human behavior and refuses to recognize the private, the ineffable, and the unpredictable. It sees the individual merely as a medical, chemical, and mechanistic entity which has no comprehension of its real interests. And on a daily basis, you usually prove that these people are right. Skinner believed, listen to me, Skinner believed that people are going to be manipulated. And he said this, quote, I just want them to be manipulated effectively, end quote. And you are. You are good little puppets on the end of the string most of the time. He measured success by the absence of resistance and counter-control on the part of the person he was manipulating. Sound familiar? He thought that his technique could be perfected to the point that the subject would not even suspect that he was being manipulated. Does that sound familiar? Most of you, until you began listening to the Hour of the Time, had no conception of what was happening. You thought you did. Dr. James V. McConnell, head of the Department of Mental Health Research at the University of Michigan, said, quote, the day has come when we can combine sensory deprivation with the use of drugs, hypnosis, and the astute manipulation of reward and punishment to gain almost absolute control over an individual's behavior. We want to reshape our society drastically, end quote. What do you think that he was talking about? How is he going to reshape our society? What was his political leaning? A United States Navy psychologist who claims that the Office of Naval Intelligence had taken convicted murderers from military prisons, used behavior modification techniques on them, and then relocated them in American embassies throughout the world. Just prior to that time, the United States Senate Intelligence Committee had censured the Central Intelligence Agency for its global political assassination plots, including plots against Fidel Castro. I was a member of the Office of Naval Intelligence, and I can tell you that it is the premier, most professional intelligence organization in this country. It's also the oldest. It was America's first intelligence organization. And it has always been, as the Navy always has been and always will be, the place where the rich and influential and the wealthy and the people who really control their world send their sons for their military education. It is also a hotbed of socialism. Most of you have never understood that the military has absolutely no interest in protecting or defending the Constitution of the United States of America because they have no constitutional rights whatsoever as career military personnel. The military, by its very nature, is Marxist and socialist. You are put into a class where you are required to stay. You cannot leave the class that you are in the military. There used to be a time where if you were an enlisted man and you behaved admirably upon the battlefield, you could receive a battlefield commission, but no more. And if you toe the mark and do exactly what you are told and never question authority, you are given a bed to sleep in, food to eat, everything that you could possibly need, each according to his ability gives, and each according to his needs receives, but only within that class structure. The New World Order, one world government, has been taught in all of our military academies for years as the only answer to war. When I was in the Office of Naval Intelligence, I began to realize that military records were flagged, and only those who belonged to certain organizations and secret societies, and only those who profess the proper political frame of mind reached the highest ranks in the officer corps of all of the military services. The officer corps of the United States of America is about to sell you to the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, and you don't even understand it. in the world could all of you blithering idiots out there be sitting there saying that Clinton is going to sign us over to the United Nations without the full cooperation, consent, and complicity of the officer corps of all of the military services of the United States of America? You say, well, they swore allegiance to protect and defend the Constitution. How do you know? When's the last time you looked at their oath? I've looked, but I'm not going to tell you what it says. And it doesn't matter anyway. Because according to the interpretation of the executive branch and the judicial branch of the government of the United States of America, the Constitution has been constitutionally superseded by the United Nations Charter by treaty, according to interpretation of Article 6 of the United States Constitution. If the officer corps has been brainwashed into accepting this erroneous interpretation of Article 6 of the United States Constitution, then they are acting in full accordance with their oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. Don't you idiots understand that? Write me some letters and tell me how you don't like to hear the way I talk to you. I need a good laugh. I need a real good laugh. And I just received an intelligence bulletin from the militia of Montana today. That gave me a good laugh. That's the militia who turned tail and let the government take Red Beckman's farm when they stated that they would hold the line and would not allow it to happen. And now they're coming up with all kinds of excuses. There are no excuses. One of the excuses was that Red Beckman didn't back them. You're a sorry group. You're a sorry bunch, and I'm damn glad I don't live in the state of Montana. The Navy psychologist that I was discussing was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Meerut of the U.S. Regional Medical Center in Naples, Italy. The information was divulged at an Oslo NATO conference of 120 psychologists from the 11-nation alliance. According to Dr. Meerut, the United States Navy was an excellent place for a researcher to find, and I quote, captive personnel, end quote, whom they could use as a guinea pig in experiments. The Navy provided all the funding necessary, according to Meerut. Dr. Meerut, folks, in a question and answer session with reporters from many nations, revealed how the Navy was secretly programming large numbers of assassins. And that is true. He said that the men he had worked with for the Navy were being prepared for commando-type operations as well as covert operations in United States embassies worldwide. He described the men who went through his program as hitmen and assassins who could kill on command. Very careful screening of the subjects was accomplished by Navy psychologists through the military records, and those who actually received assignments where their training could be utilized were drawn mainly from submarine crews. The paratroops, and many were convicted murderers serving military prison sentences, and several men who had been awarded medals for bravery were drafted into the program. These assassins were conditioned through audio-visual desensitization. The process involved the showing of films of people being injured or killed in a variety of ways, starting with very mild depictions, leading up to the more extreme forms of mayhem, just as you are being conditioned through the big eye in your living room. Eventually, the subjects would be able to detach their feelings even when viewing the most horrible of films. Can you remember, ladies and gentlemen, when the sight of blood disturbed Americans? Not anymore. Very little disturbs Americans now. That is, Americans who watch TV continually. You see, there will come a day when you will see mayhem. You'll see your neighbors dragged out and murdered in the streets. And it won't even bother you. Will not even bother you. You see, in this instance, the conditioning was most successful when applied to passive-aggressive types, and most of these ended up being able to kill without any regrets whatsoever, and most people fall into either passive or passive aggression categories because they've been taught not to resist authority. The prime indicator of violent tendencies was the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, developed by the pseudo-profession of psychology. Dr. Nehru knew of two Navy programming centers, the Neuropsychiatric Laboratory in San Diego and the United States Regional Medical Center in Italy, where he worked. During the audio-visual desensitization program, restraints were used to force the subject to view the films. When these subjects were required to watch the audio-visual desensitization images and sounds that were put before them, restraints were often used to force them to view the films. A device was used on the subject's eyelids to prevent him from blinking. Typically, the preliminary film was on an African youth being ritualistically circumcised with a dull knife and without any anesthetic. The second film showed a sawmill scene in which a man accidentally cut off his fingers. Remember, these experiments took place years ago. Most of you see these same scenes or scenes like them, and in most cases, much, much worse, every night on your television set. In addition to the desensitization films, the potential assassins underwent programming to create prejudicial attitude in the men, to think of their future enemies, especially the leaders of these countries, as subhuman. Those of us who were sent to Vietnam spent some time in training beforehand, and we were taught very subtly to change our attitudes toward the Vietnamese. And one day we found ourselves calling them gooks and slopes and slants. We were stupid. We were brainwashed. We were subjected to mind control during our training. We were taught that these people were not human, so it was easier for us to kill them. Do you understand? I hope. After his NATO lecture, Dr. Nehru disappeared. He could not be located, ladies and gentlemen, but within a week or so after the lecture, the Pentagon issued an emphatic denial that the United States Navy had ever engaged in psychological training or other types of training of personnel as assassins. As a member of the Office of Naval Intelligence at one time, I can tell you that that was a lie. The Navy disavowed the programming centers in San Diego and Naples and stated they were unable to locate Nehru, but did provide confirmation that he was a staff member of the United States Regional Medical Center in Naples. Dr. Alfred Zittani, an American delegate to the Oslo conference, did verify Nehru's remarks, and they were published in the Sunday Times. Sometime later, Dr. Nehru surfaced again in London and recanted his remarks, stating that he was, quote, talking in theoretical and not practical terms, end quote. He probably looked over his shoulder and saw one of his own subjects beginning to follow him everywhere he went. Shortly thereafter, the United States Naval Headquarters in London issued a statement indicating that Dr. Nehru's remarks at the NATO conference should be discounted because he had, quote, personal problems, end quote. Dr. Nehru never made any further public statements about the program. He was the victim of a well-known ploy. Instead of attacking the facts, instead of addressing the facts, they attack the character of the messenger. I've been the victim of this technique many times. And many of you have believed it and bought into it only to find out later that it was a lie. One of the personal attacks upon me, one of the most blatant lies ever printed or ever stated about me, was published by Lieutenant Colonel Bobo James Grites in his book, and I have since proved it false, 100% false, a total lie, by playing tapes which told the truth. The tapes were of Lieutenant Colonel James Bobo Grits telling the truth in his own voice. Most of you heard those episodes of the Hour of the Time, and you know how that type of propaganda works. But you didn't before I set you straight by playing those tapes. Many of you were devout followers of this lying Trojan horse. During the NATO conference in Oslo, Dr. Nehru had remarked that the reason he was divulging the information was because he believed that the information was coming out anyway. The doctor was referring to the disclosure by a congressional subcommittee, which were then appearing in the press concerning various CIA assassination plots. However, what Dr. Nehru had failed to realize at the time was that the Navy's assassination plots were not destined to be revealed to the public at that time. There were 3 scientists who pioneered the work of using an electromagnetic field to control human behavior. Their work began 25 years ago. And these 3 were Dr. Jose Delgado, psychology professor at Yale University, Dr. W. Ross Ade, a physiologist at the Brain Research Institute at the University of California at Los Angeles, and Dr. Wilder Penfield, a Canadian. Many of the experiments were conducted in Canada. Dr. Penfield's experiments consisted of the implantation of electrodes deep into the cortexes of epilepsy patients who were to undergo surgery. He was able to drastically improve the memories of these patients through electrical stimulation. Dr. Ade implanted transmitters in the brains of cats and chimpanzees that could send signals to a receiver regarding the electrical activity of the brain. Additional radio signals were sent back into the brains of the animals, which modified their behavior at the direction of the doctor. Dr. Delgado was able to stop and turn a charging bull through the use of an implanted radio receiver. Other experiments, ladies and gentlemen, using platinum, gold, and stainless steel electrode implants enabled researchers to induce total madness in cats, put monkeys into a stupor, or to set human beings jerking their arms up and down. Much of Delgado's work was financed by the Central Intelligence Agency through phony funding conduits masking themselves as charitable organizations. Following the successes of Delgado's work, the Central Intelligence Agency set up their own research program in the field of electromagnetic behavior modification under the code name Sleeping Beauty. With the guidance of Dr. Ivor Browning, a laboratory was set up in New Mexico, specializing in working with the hypothalamus, or the sweet spot of the brain. Here, it was found that stimulating this area could produce intense euphoria. Dr. Browning was able to wire a radio receiver amplifier into the sweet spot of a donkey, which picked up a 5 microamp signal, such that he could create intense happiness in the animal. Using the jolts of happiness as an electronic carrot, Browning was able to send the donkey up a 2,000-foot New Mexico mountain and back to its point of origin. When the donkey was proceeding up the path toward its destination, it was rewarded. When it deviated, the signal stopped. And I quote, You've never seen a donkey so eager to keep on course in your whole life. End quote, Dr. Browning exclaimed. The Central Intelligence Agency utilized the electronic carrot technique in getting trained pigeons to fly miniature microtransmitters to the ledge of a KGB safe house where the devices monitored conversations for months. There was a move within the Central Intelligence Agency to conduct further experiments on humans, foreigners, and prisoners. But officially, the White House vetoed the idea as being unethical, and as usual, experiments were carried out behind the veil of national security, reported to no one, overseen by no one. And ladies and gentlemen, having served in the Office of Naval Intelligence, I can tell you with no reservations whatsoever that whatever the public perceives to be the state of the art of mind control, brainwashing, remote control of humans, the erasure of memory and the implantation of memory which never ever happened, is way beyond the wildest dreams of even the greatest dreamers listening to this broadcast. The state of the art of the technology which has been perfected in secret, not just for mind control and brainwashing and control of people and animals, but all phases of technology, is a minimum, very bare minimum, ladies and gentlemen, of 50 to 100 years ahead of whatever the public perceives to be the state of the art of any technology. In May 1989, it was learned by the Central Intelligence Agency that the KGB was subjecting people undergoing interrogation to electromagnetic fields which produced a panic reaction, thereby bringing them closer to breaking down under questioning. These subjects were not told that they were being placed under the influence of these beings. A few years earlier, you see, folks, we've gone from Pavlov's slobbering dogs to implantation of the brain to electromagnetic beams. Can you imagine where this is going? Read one of Bud Hopkins's books. That'll give you a good idea. A few years earlier, Dr. Ross Ade released photographs and a fact sheet concerning what he called the Russian Leda machine. This consisted, folks, of a small transmitter emitting 10 hertz waves, which makes the subject susceptible to hypnotic suggestion. The device utilized the outmoded vacuum tube design. American POWs in Korea have indicated that similar devices had been used for interrogation purposes in prisoner of war camps. Now, the general long-term goal of the Central Intelligence Agency was to find out whether or not mind control could be achieved through the use of a precise, external electromagnetic beam. The electrical activity of the brain operates within the range of 100 hertz frequency. This spectrum, called the ELF, or ELF, extremely low frequency range, ELF waves carry very little ionizing radiation and very low heat, and therefore do not manifest gross observable physical effects on living organisms. But published Soviet experiments with ELFs revealed that there was a marked increase in psychiatric and central nervous system disorders and symptoms of stress for sailors working close to ELF generators. In the mid-1970s, American interest in combining EMR techniques with hypnosis was prominent. Plans, folks, were on file to develop these techniques through experiments on human volunteers. EMR is electromagnetic radiation. The spoken word of the hypnotist could be conveyed by modulated electromagnetic energy directly into the subconscious parts of the human brain without employing any technical devices for receiving or transacting the messages, and without the person exposed to such influence having a chance to control the information input consciously. Are you beginning to make connections? In California, it was discovered by Dr. Ade that animal brain waves could be altered directly by ELF fields. It was found that monkey brains would fall in phase with elf waves. These waves could easily pass through the skull, which normally protected the central nervous system from outside influence. In San Leandro, Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher, director of Technic Research Laboratory, has been doing elf brain research with human subjects for quite some time. One of the frequencies produces nausea for more than an hour. Another frequency, she calls it the marijuana frequency, gets people laughing. Quote, "Give me the money in 3 months," she says, "and I'll be able to affect the behavior of 80% of the people in this town without their even knowing it," unquote. Across this country, those of you who are alert and aware are seeing strange towers being erected. When you ask questions, you're told that these are weather towers. When you begin to investigate, and especially if you have the equipment to monitor the radiation from these towers, you find that they are emitting ELF waves. In the past, the Soviet Union has invested large sums of time and money investigating microwaves. In 1952, ladies and gentlemen, while the Cold War was showing no signs of thawing, there was a secret meeting at the Sandia Corporation in New Mexico between United States and Soviet scientists involving the exchange of information regarding the biological hazards and safety levels of electromagnetic radiation. Now that's strange. You see, in 1952, we were supposed to be in the midst of the Cold War, threatened by the atomic might of the Soviet Union. What were they doing at the Sandia Corporation? Exchanging information regarding the biological hazards and safety levels of electromagnetic radiation. They were doing what they've always been doing, folks, cooperating behind the scenes to bring about one world government. If you don't believe that, read Mikhail Gorbachev's book called Perestroika. That will open your eyes. It will also teach you the real meaning of democracy. And in his own words, don't be fooled, for we will soon control the world under our democracy. You had all better wake up very quickly. Sleep well. Good night.